4 featured modelers tonight. All belong to the same club. It's the Great Lakes Modular Group. And Jeff Shumaker is the one that brought the club to my attention. And believe it or not, Jeff and I have been talking about getting the club on this show for months now. Originally, it was scheduled, I think, sometime back in December or January, and that had a conflict, so we moved it. And the next time that we had available was tonight, and that's what we're hoping to get Jeff to tell us about the club that he belongs to. So, Jeff, if you can start us off and introduce the other members of your club that are here tonight, I'll turn it over to you, sir.
All right. Thank you, Jim. The other fellows here with me tonight are Tom Horman, Terry Davis, and Jim Foster. I'll set up my sharing here in a minute. I hope everybody can see that. And here we go. All right, the 4 of us are members of the Great Lakes HON 30 module group. We are attempting to model the main 2-foot gauge railroads in HO, actually in HON 30. Roughly, we have 12 members, not all are active. It's about 50-50 as far as modeling prototype locations on the modules as opposed to generic Maine or New England locations. The majority of prototype locations are from the WWNF, which is the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington. It was the second largest 2-foot gauge railroad in the state of Maine. And photos are from various venues we've set up at. And once I'm finished, Terry has a short presentation afterwards. We'll start off with some of Tom's modules. The first module is Glebes Log Yard. Basically, we've used it in the past as staging trains to operate on the layout. And one of the more popular modules at the meets that we set up at is Tom's Chickawaukee Pond. Chickawaukee Pond is an actual location in Maine, I believe. It's the only winter scene we have on as far as our modules go. And it's very nicely depicting an ice cutting operation on the pond. Rabbit Hill. This is one of our end modules. The gentleman there on the left, the taller gentleman, that's Jim Foster, who's also joining us tonight. Our end modules are basically 2 feet by 6 feet in dimension, and it's a 180-degree curve. So basically, when we put our modules together, we have one long oval or short oval, depending on how many people can show up for a given meet. Tom's module has a siding on it that can be used to extend. If we have an odd number of modules, we can stick the odd module on the end here. This is Jim's module, Miwapanas or Useless. It is a very versatile module. It has a small loop on it, so it can be used as a standalone module, which Jim has done on numerous occasions. It's kind of hard to see. It has a curve running off to the left here, as well as one that runs off to the right. It got cut off a little bit. So it can serve as an end module in a pinch. It could also serve as a corner module if we ever needed to set up as an L-shaped layout, which we have not had to do thus far. Tom eventually gave his Glebes Log Yard module to another member Bob Peterson, and Bob converted it to North Anderson Station. Brian Goodman built a representation of the southern terminal of the Kennebec Central Railroad, which was the shortest 2-foot gauge railroad in the state of Maine. The Kennebec Central served a old soldiers' home, which eventually became part of the VA system. And what we see here is a coal dock along the Kennebec River. Coal would be deposited in the coal dock via barges or coal schooners and hoisted up, and there was little tracks on the top with wooden cars that would haul the coal and dump it in these chutes, and then the railroad would haul the coal up to the soldiers' home, the National Soldiers' Home at Togus, Maine. Also, there was quite a bit of passenger service between Randolph and the Soldiers' Home, taking people up to visit the soldiers along with other entertainment that was available there. They had an opera house, a zoo, and a number of other things. And also bringing the inmates at the soldiers' home down to Randolph, and they could go across the bridge to Gardner, which was the larger city across the river, when they're on furlough. Lincoln Bay was built by Stephen Pinkham. It can also be used as a standalone module, as it does have has a loop of track. It also serves as a module along the sides of the layout. There's a straight section that can connect up to other modules. Glebes Landing by Phil Gleeby. We have quite a few modules depicting water on the layout. Phil's just shows a setting with, we've got a fishing boat and a small yard and a couple factories. There's an engine house hidden behind this structure here. We have the fish cannery and Weeks Mills. This is one of the prototype modules. It depicts Weeks Mills on the WWNF, which at one point had a branch running off to Winslow, Maine, and the main line ran up to Albion, Maine. This was built by Vic Hamburger, who passed away about 10 years ago. Vic was able to set up with us on one occasion. He's from Massachusetts, where the rest of us are from Ohio and Michigan. It was great to have him show up that one time. And a couple years after his passing, his widow asked if we'd like to have his module, which we gladly accepted and try to show it at any occasion we can. Ford's Mill. This is Terry's set of modules. If we want to vary the track plan away from where the track is setting, and Terry will go into a little bit more detail of that in his presentation, it basically requires to have 2 or more modules. So in this case, it starts at the back, it sweeps out on an S-curve, and then goes back at the other end to join up with the next module. Ford's Mill is also a prototypical location on the WWNF. Winds Inlet by Master Model Railroader Sam Swanson. Basically, Sam built this module based around a photo of the structure here in the center of the module. It was a picture of a structure in Down East magazine of, I think it was a lobsterman shed, although I'm not positive on that, on one of the islands of Maine. And so he started with that. has the inlet and all the other structures on the layout. East Dirigo is one of my modules. It's another N module. It's simply a 180-degree turn, depicting a generic village in the state of Maine that might have had a narrow gauge railroad running through it. Shoemaker's Mill is another one of my modules depicting a woolen mill that might have been located in the state of Maine. And I usually connect it with East Dirigo. Head Tide Cut is an actual location on the WWNF. There was a large hill that they had to cut through to keep the grade at a reasonable amount. And usually there was a church located here, and at this particular setup, apparently I didn't have the church built yet. And it's only 2 feet by 2 feet square. Head Tide Station was right after, to the north of the cut, another prototype location on the WWNF. It was the first regular station stop after the southern terminal in Wiscasset, Maine. And it had a section house. We had the depot. There was a siding served there. And the front of the module here, if you were standing there, you would be standing in the Sheepscot River. The Head Tide Station was sort of odd. It was built across the river from where the town of Head Tide was. So people had to cross a road bridge to get to the station if they wanted to take the train. Cooper's Mill is another prototype location on the WWNF. It had a different style depot and a potato house. The WWNF was known for the number of potato houses it had along its right-of-way, as the land in the area was favorable for the growing of potatoes. James Pond is another one of my N modules. Again, it can serve as a 180-degree curve. It also can serve as a side module. We have a section here that it will connect up to other modules on the side of the layout. And we've discovered that it could be used also if we needed to make an L-shaped layout. It can serve as a right-hand or a left-hand corner. And it is not a prototype location, but there is an actual James Pond in the state of Maine that's just a few miles from the old right-of-way of the WWNF. Head Tide Tank. This module is built by Pete Magoon, the current president of the NMRA. It was just further north from Head Tide Station. Basically, it's in, I would say, the wilderness. I got to visit the actual location many years ago, and I mean, fortunately, there was a sand pit with an access road that got us down to the level, and then we could walk following the old right-of-way to get to the location. Another one of Pete's modules is Whitefield. Actually, it's a 2-module combination. Again, it is a prototype location on the WWNF with the depot and the general store. Here's the other end of it. The barn is not prototypical, but we needed something to fill in make it a little less empty than what it would have been. North Whitefield is another 2-set module by Pete, depicting the village north of Whitefield. Again, we have the depot, which is almost hidden. There was a general store and what was called the cash store. And then we have the house and connected structures on the hill. This was built in TT scale for force perspective. And Winslow. Winslow was on the end of the branch from Weeks Mills, and had an engine house, a depot. Track didn't go much farther than where the depot is located, and a turntable. In 2015, Tom Horman and I took a few modules down to the National Narrow Gauge Convention in Houston. There we went up with noted modeler Bob Hayden, who had 3 modules. Bob earlier that summer had indicated he would like to sell the 3 modules that he had, so our group worked out a deal with him. So he met up with us. He set up his 3 modules for the convention, and when the convention was over, we took them home with us. Baker Stream is the oldest of these 3 modules. It was built about the same time that Shoemaker's Mill was in 1997 for the narrow gauge convention in Cincinnati, Ohio. Then we have New Glasgow. I believe that was the second one that Bob had built. We have a depot, a turntable, passing siding. Actually, this is a covered depot. We can run trains through it, or at least one time there was. We hope to put a new covered depot on it at some point. And then Hammondsfield. Hammondsfield and Baker Stream were prototype locations on the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes Railroad, although these are not actually prototype scenes. I think there was a sand or gravel pit at Hammondsfield. I'm not positive on that. This is in Tom's possession, and he added a sawmill to it. So that takes care of my part of the presentation. Terry, if you want to get set up, we can go from there. How do I, let's see.
Go up to the top and you can
stop share.
There you go.
That helps. There we go.
All right.
Quick question. Did I see a very large rabbit on one of those?
Yes, you did. There's also a duck in an earlier shot.
I think it was probably, well, it was before I got together with this group in 2004, some visitor to the layout left the rabbit, and that became a mascot.
Well, actually, what had happened is the first time we set up, I think there might have been 4, maybe a half a dozen of us at the time. We were in a mall at an open storefront, and I happened to be looking around at some of the different stuff that had been left behind in the storefront, and found this stuffed rabbit. So he immediately became our mascot, and his name is Bun Rab. And as Jim Foster has said, you don't want to stick your finger too close to him because he does security on the layout. And he has about a half a dozen cohorts that help guard the layout during shows.
We also use them as a way for little kids. We can say, can you find the rabbit? Can you find the duck? And so it gives them something to look at if they're not really that keyed up about watching little trains run around. We also say we take our modeling seriously, but we do not take ourselves seriously. I'm going to, what happened is when Jeff said, yeah, we're going to present the layout, slides were being sent around. I put together a presentation. Jeff put together a presentation. So I'll run through this. I don't think there's that much overlap. But this is a picture of the group about 10 years ago. Yeah, I've got a lot darker hair there than I do now. And this is what the layout looked like at Hickory, North Carolina 10 years ago. Not everybody was able to go, but it was a pretty decent size setup. And that's what the other side looks like. The lights are manufactured. I think Jeff did most of those, but they come in very handy for helping highlight the layout. We can also
The idea came from Pete Magoon.
Okay.
From
yeah.
he got the idea from I think, and it was an HO standard gauge layout up in New England. I want to say New Hampshire. They had that style of light, and it's a nice style, and it does add to the presentation of the layout.
What'd you make them out of, Jeff?
It's 1/2 inch. Oh shoot, I drawn a blank. The name of the basically conduit.
Yeah.
And pardon?
EMT?
Could be. All I do is look for 1/2 inch metal conduit in Lowe's. And I know where it is in the local Lowe's, so I don't have to ask for it. It's a utility light with a 5.5 inch bell on it. And we add a longer extension cord so that it's able, we can daisy chain it around the layout.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Very nice.
This is a smaller setup at Carillon Park, but we have set up at times where we've only had 2 modules on the side and 2 end modules. Critical issue is having the end modules. And this was a setup, a slightly out of focus picture at one of the national narrow gauge shows.
I think that's Minneapolis. Or no, maybe it was Portland.
Augusta. Portland. No, that's Augusta, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah. Basically, we're modeling the main 2-foot narrow gauges, unique to Maine, 193, 93, 95 miles of track. End scale is what we use because we can use the mechanisms, the trucks, the track, but it scales out to be 30 inches. So it's actually HON 30 instead of HON 2. And why do we model this? Because, boy, the equipment is sure cute. And that's at the WWNF Railway Museum. And if you ever get a chance to go up to Alna, Maine, which is a little north of Wiscasset in the Booth Bay area, it's well worth going and checking out what they've done. They've got about 3 miles of track laid. Jeff goes out there twice a year and volunteers for a week. There's an idea. You can see the difference in the equipment. That's a 2-foot gauge car on the right and then a standard gauge car on the left. Everything had to be smaller. Passenger cars had 1 row of seats on either side of the aisle. Okay, we don't actually have memberships or dues. We just get together. We've got an email list that we, send stuff back and forth on. And then I've got a bunch of pictures of just some of the modeling. This is Jim Foster's module. This is the one that can be used in a variety of different ways. That's also his module. This is the North Whitefield model that Pete Magoon built. That's the TT scale house in the background for force perspective. Okay, the basic standards, 48 inches from floor to rail top. The concept when the guys put these together is that the train would go through the scenery. The scenery and the structures were going to be to the forefront, the train would be behind, which is fine, but it does create interesting issues if you're trying to build something and most of what you want is going to be behind the track. And I'll talk about that a little bit further. Modules are 24 inches, 30 inches wide, and we keep them at our own houses. We don't have a central location. This is the modules that Sam, or the module that Sam built, Winds Inlet. This has been featured in the Narrow Gauge Gazette, I think 13 articles on the construction of this. It's another picture of that. This is a overhead view of Ford and King's Mill. It's another picture of it. This is the Chickawaukee Pond that Tom built. Head tide tank. We had a nice little thing happen about 4 years ago when Mini Trains released a ready-to-run locomotive with a flywheel in it that looks pretty close to a main 40. And so that's been a major boom. Prior to that, everything had to be in-scale mechanism and kits that various people produced put over the top of them. Like that's what this is. Jeff, what is the history on this one?
I think that's Jim's locomotive now. A friend of ours, Bill Vollmer, built it based on an article in Model Railroader. I want to say the early 2000s. It might have been before that. And he went from HON30 into ON30 and sold off most of his HON30 equipment. And Jim ended up with that. Jim, if you want to add anything to that, go right ahead.
I believe that the mechanism is an N-scale dockside, which is a very versatile mechanism with a couple of pattern failures associated with it. And if you get a good one, they're very smooth, they're very reliable. And the body on that was a combination white metal and brass kit.
One of the most popular soft drinks in the country at one point in time was Moxie Cola, which is the state soft drink of Maine. They did not put it in tank cars, but again, this is just with chowder. This is the log yard that Tom built. Another picture of that locomotive that Jim has. Shoemaker's Mill.
What's the Jim? Can you tell him what the passenger car kit, those two kits were?
I believe they're Railway Recollections kits.
About 50% of the structures on the layout are scratch built, and about 50 are kits. Yeah, this is one of Pete's modules. That's Winslow. Some different perspective of the layout. There's the farm scene. And so you can see we range from Traverse City to Cincinnati, Ohio. And we've got people that are affiliated with us in several different places. In fact, one is in the United Kingdom temporarily. And there's our duck security crew, but this is what the layout looks like looking up above. The aisle in the back is strictly for the electrical stuff. It's not, you know, we stand out in front of it when we're actually displaying it. This is Jim Foster's module again. That's Gleby's inlet or landing. Another view of head tide tank. And there's the Ford and King's Mills. This is Whitefield. North Whitefield. It's an interesting setup they have in Maine. Everything is within a city limit. And so you'll have these areas that are named as a city that are extremely rural.
And what is the quote newest locomotive on the layout? Time wise, scenery wise, I guess.
I can answer that.
Yeah.
Mine is set in 1940. So that's why you saw some newer vehicles on it. There's a 1940 Ford, which would essentially be new, except it's filthy. It's being driven on dirt roads. The dump truck is a 1936 Ford. It's also filthy. And then there's also a 37 Chevy next to this house that you see on the picture here. And it's 3 years old. And of course, it's very dirty. The reason I chose 1940 was to allow certain kinds of things like that. And 1940 is still consistent with two of the main two footers. They were still operating at that time. I would say that the other modules are set in the teens and 20s. Mine is the only one that's a later version.
Well, I mean, well, I probably wasn't making myself clear. I was talking about locomotive wise.
Locomotive,
Okay,
I would say that, well, all right, let me back up a little bit. All of the steam locomotives date from what I would say is prior to about 1920. We do have some diesels that we use from time to time just to keep the layout operating, and along with some rail buses. But the steam locomotives are definitely over 100 years old.
Thank you.
The none of the main two footers ran diesels, but there were industrial lines that were set to 2-foot gauge that did. And in the early days, trying to get a steam locomotive for HON 30 was just very difficult, especially one that would run reliably. I'm not sure what the mechanism and the kit was on this. There's our duck on security crew.
The kit, oh geez, it was a brass etch kit developed, I want to say back in the mid to late 70s.
That Robert Sloan, I believe.
There you go. I couldn't remember the name. It was Robert Sloan etching. The mechanism is a Minitrix 060 with the rear driver removed. The opening where the rear driver would be is covered by the ash pan. I got this at a train show years ago. And I repainted the cab and tank because a lot of the locomotives early on were painted with I don't want to call it a Pullman green, but it was some sort of an olive green. I can't remember what Baldwin called that color. I think they started it. The Portland Locomotive Works, which is what this particular model represents, followed suit. Eventually, they went away from the colors and just painted the cabs black. In some cases, even the domes were painted whatever color the cab and tank were. But it's actually an 060 mechanism with the rear driver removed.
As an aside, the WWF Museum in Alna, Maine does have a number of industrial 2-foot locomotives that they use for work trains and general maintenance and their summertime track laying activities, which a friend of mine has invited me to participate in. However, after 60 years of laying spikes, he's much better at it and in much better shape. But they use diesels day in and day out up there when they're not running the steam.
The Alma, Maine, is that the railroad that used to be at the docks down in Portland?
Sort of. The main narrow gauge, which you're referring to down in Portland, is still there. The property that the museum proper was on was sold. So they had to come up with a plan to sort of tide them over until they got a new building built along the right of way, which they have their track. That's in the process of being done. In the meantime, they have sort of joined with the WWF Museum, and much of their historical equipment has been moved up to the WWF. There's cars from the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes, Bridgeton and Saco River, and as well as the WWF up there.
I was at Portland several years ago and saw the engine shed, talked to one of the volunteers up there, but never got to look inside of it because they had 2 steam engines inside. I would love to have seen.
Well, they actually have 4 steam engines, 2 of which are operable. The 2 that aren't are currently up at Alna on display. One of them is, I believe, is still down at Portland for when they operate. And the 4th one travels back and forth. Sometimes it's at Portland, sometimes it's up at the WWF. And this just recently happened shortly before the pandemic hit. So things are kind of fluid. I suspect that once they get their new structure built, some of the equipment will be moving back down to Portland.
There are a couple of videos on YouTube of the steam up last about a year ago, and they're well worth watching. They've got at least 3, if not 4, Forneys fired up. This is a fellow that comes around with us occasionally. He has a bunch of Maine 2-foot stuff in 45 millimeter gauge, and a lot of it's live steam. I'm going to wrap up. I've got about 12 slides. I just want to kind of show a little bit how I developed my modules for this, and started off with the original pictures and said, that looks kind of neat. I'd like to really do that. And this is the 2 weirs that are out in the middle of the pond behind the dam to direct the timber over to the sawmill. That's one of those weirs. That's what it looks like now. There's another view of the 2 mills. And you can see Ford's mill on the left, and there was a bridge that was right nearby. And so those were the things I wanted to incorporate in what I was modeling. So built the modules, the legs fold up inside for transport. And I used an angle beam to keep the legs up. And the thing that I ran into is, in order to make sure that where my modules were going to fit into what had been modeled on either end of it, as far as prototype, all the stuff needed to be behind the track for the river to flow the right way. So I decided to go with a 30-inch wide module and had to use 2 modules in order to do it. And this is basically what the map looked like of what I was trying to model, and I wanted to get the area basically right there into the module. And so there's shaping the foam that I used for the base. I drew up my plans for both structures with Corel Draw, basically used a caliper and, appropriate windows that I was able to get from a grant line. And in 2007, I had the rough part of it ready to go. 2008, there's a little bit more shrubbery and stuff. The bridge is used to cover the gap between the two modules, part of it. Started putting the picture that I used on the front of the module so people could see what I was doing. There's a picture from 2015, I think. 2016, I got, had a couple of pictures that was in a British narrow gauge magazine. This is the convention that was in Augusta, Maine. And that's from that convention. And then in 2018, we set up in Minneapolis at the narrow gauge convention. And the major difference in this picture is you can see there's been some flowers added. My wife has enjoyed doing some of the landscaping, and she also painted the backdrops for me, which has been really beneficial because I'm red, green, brown colorblind, and so scenery can be a challenge at times. And this is the layout set up at the annual narrow gauge show that's held near Youngstown, Ohio, and usually in March. It's been canceled the last 2 years. So that's what we've got. And if you have any further comments or questions that you'd like to get information on, there's our email addresses. And anybody have any questions or?
Well, I do. Wouldn't Z-scale be more correct in size or no?
What scale?
If we were using like Z-scale track,
Yes.
it is actually under 2 feet. There's a German manufacturer. Is it Bush?
Believe that's so.
Yeah, it's recently come out with what's called HOF, and it's HO scale running on Z scale track. And it's basically industrial stuff. The reason why we're using N scale is that's when this started. There were a few modelers back in the late 60s, Dave Frary and Bob Hayden being two of them. They couldn't actually model it in actual 2-foot scale because there weren't motors small enough at that time. And with the introduction of N scale, they thought, hey, well, this might work. The mechanisms were about the right size. So they were just taking mechanisms and scratch building superstructures on them. And the fact that N scale was 6 inches wider than the prototype, that didn't bother them. So that's how it got started. And we've stuck to it ever since.
It apparently didn't bother Bachmann when they decided to release their ON30 modules models either. And they've done amazing things for narrow gauge modeling. There's a lot of people that model in ON30.
I would also add, as a practical matter, N-scale mechanisms are so good now that you can make a really nice operating layout in HON30. And I don't think that any of us consider it cheating.
Well, I have a question for you. Gentlemen, what's next for the club?
Finding a few younger members that can help us get these things into where we're setting up.
That's an interesting question, sir. I can tell you that if all of us are basically present, and I think the closest we have been to that was at the National Narrow Gauge Convention in Augusta, Maine. The layout is 44 feet long. And it's unusual for us to be in a spot that'll give us 44 feet. As a practical matter, we tend to be somewhat less than that. It's an interesting question, what you just asked. I would guess that I'm not sure we can make it bigger, but we may be able to sometime make it L-shaped. And there's always little things to do to any layout, and you all would know that. But is there going to be a gross change? I would doubt it.
You have beautiful layout, beautiful modules. You all ought to really be proud of what you've accomplished and the detail and prototypical views that you've incorporated into your modeling. It's fantastic.
Well, thank you.
Very kind of you, sir. Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions for Jeff and the other people?
Gentlemen, I've enjoyed the living daylights out of this, but I have to leave. The dog is hollering. And when the dog hollers, that means one thing. It means we got to go outside. So thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for looking at our layout. I'm glad you liked it.
Oh, I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. Thanks so much for coming. Jeff, I appreciate so much you being the leader of this for me and putting all this together. I really do appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for taking the time and sharing your layout with us.
It was our pleasure.
All right.